And then we'll go ahead and jump right into our webinar and in-person presentation, Reconnecting Nature. Just want to go through some background and insights on, from us as well as the state agencies on crossings and the way that we can collaborate on them, safety and conservation. So first, we're going to go ahead and go through some intros from our hosts, and give you some background on the organizations and agencies that we work for. So I'll go ahead and start off. So I'm Justin. I'm our conservation advocate with Environment Oregon, which is a statewide nonprofit environmental advocacy organization. And we are focused on protecting the natural world. So, we engage in research and public education, grassroots organizing, advocacy, and litigation. And, all of that is to work toward our vision of an Oregon that protects and restores more places where all life can thrive and, offers us the opportunity, us and future generations, the opportunity to live, healthier, more meaningful lives. And so, as the conservation advocate, I focus on campaigns that protect land-based wildlife and wild places. From our campaign to support our state parks to defending roadless areas, and reconnecting nature, which is what we're going to talk about today. To give a little bit of background on the campaign, before I pass it off to Kat, wildlife and natural areas, they're really one of the things that make Oregon a special place to live. But wildlife in Oregon are, really, they end up being stranded by tens of thousands of miles of roads that lead to millions of wildlife vehicle collisions each year in Oregon. Animals lose their lives, drivers are put in danger, and our ecosystems suffer. And wildlife crossings are really a proven solution. In some cases, they've reduced collisions by more than 90%, and they restore safe migration routes. And so, Oregon can build more of them with smart policy and steady funding. And so our Reconnecting Nature campaign is pushing for updated state standards, to, as well as dedicated long-term investment in these types of projects, which can also unlock federal dollars to make sure this happens. This is really our chance to save wildlife, protect drivers, reconnect Oregon's fractured habitats. And so, this is the time that we have to build bridges that nature needs. And with that, I'll hand it off to Kat to give some background, introduce herself, give some background on Osberg students.
Awesome. Yeah. My name's Kat. I'm at the University of Oregon with Osberg Students, standing for Oregon Students Public Interest Research Group. And I coordinate our Wildlife Crossings campaign here on campus. So Osberg's a nonprofit advocacy group that's both student-run and student-funded. And we've been here at the U of O for over 50 years now. We really focus on working on social and environmental issues that our students and the greater public care about. And this term, we've been running a wildlife crossings campaign, like Justin talked about. We're really working just to build broad support and win the hearts and minds of people across our state and on our campus. And we've done things from business canvassing to petitioning to just getting into lecture halls and talking to students. Today, we really focus on educational outreach on our campus, and we're able to collect more photo petitions and surveys and just really talk to so many people on our campus. Yeah, we're super excited to be talking with state agencies today, talking to students, and really educating the public. I'm going to pass it off to Sydney.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sydney Bowman. I work for the Oregon Department of Transportation as the Wildlife Passage Coordinator. I'm based in Bend, but my position is statewide. ODOT's Wildlife Passage Program is unfunded, and it has been for about going on 12 years. So a lot of what I do is try to work with project teams to incorporate wildlife passage when and where it makes sense. And then I oversee monitoring for any projects that we do construct, and then serve as a liaison to our state and federal partners, mainly ODFW and Forest Service.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Wheat. I'm with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. My position title is Wildlife Connectivity Coordinator. I'm based out of our headquarters office in Salem. My position works with everything wildlife movement and migration, which touches basically every conservation topic you can think of, from land development to resource extraction to climate change to agriculture, but it also extends into transportation mitigation, so looking at how we can get wildlife safely across roadways.
Thank you both. And then we'll go to this next slide and let you take it away, Rachel.
So we have something like 162,000 miles of roadways in Oregon, and they have tremendous impacts on wildlife. This is an issue that we may think of something like roadkill as being a very visible impact of roadways, but roadways actually have a number of other impacts on wildlife population. First and foremost is pollution. So we can think of something like runoff from vehicles and roadways into our soils and waterways. That's things like oil and gasoline and tire particles that can have numerous effects on the populations in our wetlands and our streams and our soils. But that pollution is also things like light pollution and noise pollution. There's a variety of unusual smells and vibrations and sounds and lights associated with roadways that can deter wildlife from using habitat near roads. There's also physical barriers to movement that roadways create. You can think of something like Jersey barriers, those concrete triangular shapes that are often placed along the side of a road or in the middle of a road. Something like a deer could probably hop over that pretty easily, but smaller bodied wildlife can't always get over those, and that's a physical impediment to movement. And we also have things like right-of-way fencing. So this is fencing that's placed on either side of our state highways that can block wildlife from moving across a road. And then traffic volumes themselves, high traffic speeds can become a fence of sorts. If we get to a point where traffic is going consistently and quickly enough, there's really no gaps in traffic for an animal to be able to try to cross. And so then those roads are acting as an impediment to movement. These roads are fragmenting habitat, they're bisecting the landscape. Each of these new roads is increasing isolation of those individual habitat patches, and linear infrastructure tends to beget more linear infrastructure. New roads often lead to things like new housing developments and new fencing and greater access for people to recreational opportunities, which is bringing humans in closer conflict with wildlife. And there's also behavioral impacts from roadways as well. There's been a variety of studies that have illustrated that wildlife avoid otherwise high quality habitats near roads due to perceived risk of predation or that fear from the noise and lights and smells. Wildlife have altered activity patterns near roadways. They have increased vigilance near roadways. Some species change their vocalization patterns. There's been work with songbirds that show that they sing differently near roadways, probably because the volume of that traffic going by, the audible volume is high enough that they can't even hear themselves sing in some cases. They spend reduced time foraging, and cumulatively those can have a variety of impacts and population level consequences on wildlife, where we have reduced reproductive success, smaller populations, more isolated populations. And then, of course, the final two here are direct mortality and biodiversity loss. These are the big ones. We don't really have a good way to census roadkill, so we have to rely on estimates from individual studies that are going out and surveying roadsides for road-killed animals for those carcasses. But we have to keep in mind that species may be injured by a vehicle and then escape the roadway only to die elsewhere, somewhere away from the roadway. And so those individuals that are injured on the roadside by a car, but then move away from the road before perishing, those don't get accounted for in those surveys. Smaller bodied species may also just be obliterated by a vehicle. Their smaller bodied species are easier for scavengers to consume very quickly. So if you think about something like a frog or a small lizard or a small mouse, a scavenger could come and pick that up and carry it away. And so that may be missed in some of these surveys. And those smaller carcasses also persist for shorter times on the landscape. So if you think about something like the carcass of a large-bodied animal like a deer or a coyote or a cougar, those can last a long time. You can see their bones degrade over time. But some of those small-bodied species, those don't persist very long. So we have to do a lot of calculations to try to account for that when we try to estimate how many species are killed by roadways, and account for the fact that some of those smaller bodied species are more easily missed, and then we have animals that are being injured and maybe dying elsewhere. But based on the studies that we do have and that have been completed using these surveys, next slide. It's estimated that about 1 million animals are killed on roadways in the United States per day. And if we extrapolate that to Oregon, based on the number of road miles in the state, that works out to an estimated minimum of 14.5 million wild vertebrate animals that are killed each year on Oregon's roadways. And this is just wild vertebrate animals. This doesn't even touch invertebrates, all of our invertebrate pollinators, our butterflies, our bees, our flies, our beetles. And we can imagine that the impact on those taxa are probably many orders of magnitude higher. And it's not surprising, of course, that a loss at this scale has a significant toll on biodiversity. In the United States in total, there are nearly 24 species that are listed on the Federal Threatened and Endangered Species Act, for which road mortality is among the major threat to survival of the species. Think about species like Florida panther in the Florida Everglades or the red wolf in North Carolina. Those species are primarily being affected by road mortality. That is the primary driver of the loss of those species. And here in Oregon, we actually have a couple species for which road mortality is threatening the existence. That's our coastal Pacific martin, a very cute weasel-like creature that lives out on the coast. And then we have our northwestern pond turtle. So these are two species that are impacted by road mortality. The coastal Pacific martin is federally threatened, and the northwestern pond turtle has been determined needing to be threatened status. So they're in the process of being added to the Endangered Species Act. And there have really been hundreds of studies worldwide illustrating that these transportation networks that we have imperil wildlife population persistence. Next slide. Now, fortunately, we do have a proven method to help mitigate for impacts of roadways on wildlife, and that's these wildlife crossing structures. So these are things like bridges or tunnels or culverts that we can build for the explicit purpose of wildlife use, that wildlife can use to either pass safely under or over a roadway, and they don't have to cross traffic at all. These tend to be most effective when they're paired with directional fencing or directional walls. We often get the question about how do animals find these structures? How do you expect it, if you're going to spend a bunch of money to build a bridge, how do you expect an animal's even going to find it? Well, it takes time. Like, animals are capable of learning. And so over time, they may learn where the structure is and safely use it. But then we can also use assistance of fencing or walls that will block an animal from going onto the roadway so they don't get hit. And then we'll also funnel them towards the entrance of that new crossing structure. And we see that reflected in monitoring studies of the crossings that have been implemented across the world, that over a period of time after the crossing has been constructed, we see an increase in wildlife use over time. Next slide. But one of the things that we need to think about when we're implementing these wildlife crossing structures is where to put them. And obviously, we need to be building these wildlife crossing structures where the wildlife are moving. And so we need to leverage data to make sure that we're placing them in the right areas. So we look at things like species movement, or habitat connectivity models. We look at animal tracking data. We look at roadkill records. And some of the places that tend to be most suited for these wildlife crossing structures are things like riparian corridors. And this is especially true in urban areas. Urban areas where we have a lot of development, we often still have greenways alongside our rivers and our streams where there's some natural habitat in place that's being protected. A lot of wildlife use those riparian corridors to move through urban environments. So those tend to be places where we see a lot of roadkill as a stream passes under a roadway. There's not enough room for wildlife to go under the roadway with the stream, so they pop up on the road and they get hit. The other thing that we look at is migratory pathways. So animals that have distinct migratory cycles, they're moving back and forth between a distinct winter and a summer range or other types of seasonal ranges. Oftentimes these wildlife are following the same travel pathways year in, year out. This is true for mule deer, for example, and Rocky Mountain elk. And so if we can place a wildlife crossing structure in an area where we have that migratory movement, oftentimes that helps decrease wildlife vehicle collision significantly. And then here in Oregon, we actually have a tool that we developed to identify priority wildlife connectivity areas. So these are the parts of the landscape that are disproportionately valuable at facilitating wildlife movement. And the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife developed this tool based on a connectivity assessment of a broad diversity of species in Oregon, looking at habitat suitability and the ability of habitat to facilitate movement across the landscape for different species. And we mapped out these priority wildlife connectivity areas. And so we know that if we place a wildlife crossing structure in the areas where those priority wildlife connectivity areas intersect with our roadways, those are likely going to be really good spots to facilitate movement of a diversity of species. The other thing we have to keep in mind is that there are other considerations that have to go into where they place these structures. Geotechnical constraints is one. So what does the soil look like? Can the soil support a crossing structure? What does the adjacent land use look like? Do we have privately owned land that may become a residential development in the future? Does it make sense to put a crossing structure there if the habitat on either side of the roadway isn't going to be protected long term? So there's a variety of other considerations that have to go into determining where to place these structures. Next slide. And the other thing that we have to consider when we're building out these structures is that the way that different species move tends to be species specific. So different species need different features to feel comfortable using a crossing structure. Some species need a lot of overhead clearance. They don't like to feel constrained, so they do better on an overpass than on an underpass. Some species need cover elements to feel secure from predation, and so they need more tight enclosed structures with less open area. And so there's a variety of different crossing structures that have been developed in different places throughout the world to account for these individual species habitat needs. So you can see some of the images on the slide. We have everything from an arboreal bridge facilitating movement of this primate species. We have a very small culvert that's right at the road surface that is helping passage of probably some small amphibians and reptiles. We actually have a bridge built for crabs in Australia that was designed specifically for crabs to be able to crawl up and get over. There's a penguin crossing in New Zealand. So there's all these different crossing designs that have been developed to meet species-specific needs. Unfortunately, there are no one-size-fits-all solutions in these crossing structures. So there's a variety of things that we can do to make crossing structures appealing to a diversity of species, and we try to do those in the projects that we implement. But there's not a single crossing design that's going to suit all species in an area. And the other difficulty is that a lot of departments of transportation are focused on motorist safety. So their mission statement is on motorist safety rather than wildlife safety. And so we don't often have the ability to address some of the smaller species needs. And I will pass it over to Sydney to talk about the work that ODOT has been doing with motorist safety.
Sydney, I think you might be muted.
Thanks. Sorry about that. So the figure here is showing ODOT's project life cycle. So typical ODOT projects run between 1.5 years and 2 years. So not quick. They take a long time to plan and to implement. The orange is showing the feasibility study, the project planning, the really early work that goes into selecting projects. For wildlife passage, this is when we would like to do pre-construction monitoring. So we can put cameras out on site to see where animals are moving, or use collar data from larger species to see where they're moving across the landscape. And again, feasibility studies can help identify exact locations. Once a project is selected, it goes into the project design phase, and this is the longest phase. It's where we start doing our environmental permitting. So we find out where archaeosites are, what other impacts there are to fish and wildlife, what other constraints there might be due to some of the geotech, other right-of-way issues and land ownership issues. So those all get worked out in the design phase. And this is where we'd also work closely with ODFW to get wildlife passage structures designed appropriately for the target species. We then move into construction, where it's pretty self-explanatory. We build the structure, do that again with biologists on site to make sure they're done appropriately, and then really focusing on the post-construction revegetation, trying to get that habitat back into a more natural state to help attract wildlife to them. And then ongoing vegetation management as part of maintenance, also maintaining other features like the fencing that Rachel mentioned, to make sure that they continue to function as designed. Next slide. So Rachel alluded to the number of wildlife vehicle collisions for all critters, but yeah, ODOT is definitely more focused on the larger species since they can cause serious issues for drivers, personal injury, people can end up in the hospital, there's time off of work. They can be causes fatality or serious long-term permanent damage to people. So we have 1,679 on average reported crashes in Oregon that results in a cost of 327 million to drivers and more than 6,000 annual deer vehicle collisions. And like Rachel mentioned earlier, that's a really conservative number since most animals do wander off the highway and die later, at least 2 to 3 times this number. Next slide. This is a rendering of a wildlife overcrossing that we're hoping to get built in Southwest Oregon. It would be the first one in the state. This was a project put forward by ODFW and ODOT and a number of nonprofit partners for a federal grant. It's the Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program. It's been around for about 4 years now. And ODOT was successful in getting a grant to construct this overcrossing. So we're still working on getting the money transferred to ODOT. There's been a lot of activity at the federal level. It's been sort of a start and stop effort. But we're hoping to get this started in construction in 2027. This was designed for large species like deer. We also have black bear in the area, but because it's so large, it will definitely benefit a large range of species. And it's going to connect the Cascade Siskiyou Monument in Southwest Oregon. So we're all very excited to get this project going and hopefully it will serve as a bit of a demonstration project, not just along the I-5 corridor, but really statewide for what wildlife overcrossings can accomplish. Next slide. These 5 images here are showing the wildlife undercrossings that have been built under US 97 in Central Oregon between Bend and the Gilcrest area, about an hour south of Bend. These are all designed mostly for mule deer and elk. So they're quite large. But again, the benefit of these, when you build it for large things, you benefit a lot of the other smaller creatures as well. And so OSU Cascades has been monitoring these structures for effectiveness. We see over 30 species do benefit when we deploy wildlife cameras to help with monitoring. So most of these are done during the early stages. The vegetation takes a little while to come back, but over time, we do tend to see increased use by different species. Next slide. This is an image showing some of the fencing and deer guards. So wildlife fencing, as Rachel mentioned, is really critical to making sure that these projects are successful. You get so many more species using them when you do install wildlife fencing, and they're almost 50% less likely to have deer vehicle collisions when you do have fencing. So really important, but inevitably you have gaps in the fence if you have on and off ramps or driveways, other access roads. So the yellow here is showing what we call a modified cattle guard to prevent wildlife from crossing into the highway. Next slide. We also install what we call jump outs. So this is, it's a ramp from the highway to the fence where the animal can jump back onto the wild side of the fence. But they're high enough so that animals won't actually jump onto them and get into the highway. So we try and place these every mile or so, again, to encourage animals that do find the way maybe around fence ends, or if there's ever a break in the fence from weather, or we have cars going off the highway sometimes that causes damage to fences. So this is another way to get animals back off the highway and away from the road. Next slide. Back to Rachel.
Yeah, so while the Oregon Department of Transportation has been sort of slowly implementing some of these crossing structures, especially on US 97 for larger bodied species like deer and elk, crossing structures for smaller species are just as important. Unfortunately, we only have one dedicated wildlife passage structure for smaller species in Oregon on our state highway system. This is a new structure that just went on US 30 outside Portland, specifically designed for native amphibians, including northern red-legged frog. So much like our migratory mule deer, our northern red-legged frogs are migrating between summer and winter range. They have to cross the highway to do so. They're very small and very easy to be obliterated by trucks and cars. And so this crossing structure that's pictured here on the right-hand side of the slide is a view of the interior of that structure. It's much smaller, so not able to pass deer and elk, but very well suited to pass frogs and salamanders and other small-bodied species. As Sydney mentioned, there are some features that we can incorporate into some of those larger structures that can help small species use large crossings. Those big open areas are sometimes intimidating to smaller bodied species who feel, insecure from potential predation. They need some cover elements. There was actually a study that was done relatively recently by the US Geological Survey that showed that even putting a few cinder blocks and PVC pipes in one of those big open structures can increase use of smaller bodied species by almost 40%. So that's things like rabbits and hares and snakes and mice and all sorts of the smaller creatures that just need a little bit of security going through that big, otherwise open space, because vegetation doesn't really grow inside those underpasses. These projects that are for smaller bodied species in particular are really critical, especially when we have instances where there's a species that is, threatened with extinction due to road mortality or due to other factors. But it tends to be very, very difficult to find funding to implement these projects, and difficult in some cases to get the appropriate permits in place to implement these projects. Next slide. But we do have other opportunities to address wildlife passage that aren't specific wildlife crossing structures. So we have a lot of structures that already run under the roadway to control things like water bodies and fish passage, our streams. We have tons of streams, especially in Western Oregon. They all need to pass under the roadway, and so that's a natural opportunity for a wildlife individual to move under the roadway as well. The problem is that these structures are often not even big enough to pass water, let alone water and wildlife. And so there are some opportunities here for co-benefits that can address multiple issues simultaneously. So when we're going in and we're replacing outdated water control culverts, if we make that culvert a little bit larger, it can pass the water, and in addition, it can pass some wildlife as well. Or for example, if we are looking at climate change and flood hazard risk, and we're going in and we're replacing old water control structures like culverts and pipes, we want to make those big enough to accommodate unusual large-scale flooding that's expected to increase over time as the climate changes. But that structure, making that structure large enough to accommodate, a 100-year or 1,000-year flood, which is expected to become more common, is also going to make that structure large enough to be able to accommodate wildlife use as well. So in addition to addressing flood hazard risk, we can also address wildlife passage issues. The last thing I'll touch on here is that some of these structures that aren't built for wildlife can still potentially facilitate wildlife movement with just some minor design modifications. So in this photo, you see an inundated culvert. There's water in there. A lot of wildlife do not like to move through water when crossing under a roadway. But something as simple as putting up some wooden boards on the side to make a little elevated pathway that's out of the water can allow wildlife to go under the highway or under the roadway using that structure. So some of these minor cheap design modifications can make these non-purpose-built structures more wildlife friendly, or some of these minor design features can make some of those larger structures built for larger bodied wildlife friendlier to other taxa. Next slide. So what can we do as we move here into the future? I think first and foremost is follow traffic laws. I mean, especially with this Thanksgiving being this week, there's a lot of people that are going to be out and traveling. Many of you may be traveling home or to see friends or family or to go recreate somewhere. Follow the traffic laws, wear your seatbelt, follow the speed limits. Those rules are in place for a reason. And those, yellow diamonds with the leaping deer that you see everywhere, pay attention to those signs. Those signs were put there in place because there has been an issue with wildlife vehicle collisions in that area in the past. Drivers tend to become very complacent because we see those signs everywhere and we don't see wildlife that often. But if you do pay attention to those signs and you do become more vigilant when you see them, that can help reduce those wildlife vehicle collisions. Also, if you see wildlife, don't watch where the wildlife are going, watch where the wildlife came from. Oftentimes there are going to be multiple individuals that are crossing the road. So if a deer darts out in front of your car and you're fortunate enough not to hit it, be paying attention where that deer came from, because there's a good chance that there might be another deer on the way. Slow down, become vigilant, keep your eyes open. If this topic is important to you, or if any topic is important to you, reach out to your local legislators to let them know. And then one thing that I always advocate for is a really good way for anybody to get involved in helping us with this particular subject matter is to participate in a community science effort. So the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife maintains an iNaturalist project called Roadkills of Oregon. The QR code on the screen will take you to that project on iNaturalist. And this is a way that anybody can contribute information on roadkills in the state of Oregon that helps us better understand the species that are affected, the times of year where roadkills are the greatest, and identifying some of those roadkill hotspots that may help us decide where to site some of these wildlife crossing structures in the future. So all you need is a camera or a cell phone. If you are out on your way to campus, or you're walking somewhere, or you're driving, or you're biking, and you see a road-killed animal, stop, snap a photo, add it to the project on iNaturalist. That goes into our database, and then we're able to pull those data out later on and use those to try to figure out where we may need to look at some of these mitigation options, including wildlife crossing structures.
Do you want to expand on that, Kat?
Yeah, I could go back.
Ways for folks.
Yeah. So as well as all of those options that Rachel talked about, we do a lot of work as Osberg students here on campus. Like there's mostly students on this meeting right now. So there's always opportunities to get involved with us. We go up to Salem and we lobby so you can speak directly to your legislators about issues that matter to you. We're always working to educate students on campus and go talk to local businesses off campus. So I'd say if any of this is interesting to you, you want to get involved, there's always an opportunity. Come find us. We'd love to help you do what you're passionate about, have you help us work on some of the things we're already doing. Anything of those sorts.
Yeah, that's great.
Awesome. Okay.
So we're doing pretty well on time. Sydney, did you have anything else to add from ODOT's perspective on the future or moving forward?
Well,
Aside from following the traffic laws.
yeah. Yeah, we have like some guidance we like to give drivers, like beyond just wearing your seatbelt, like use your high beams, so you can see a broader area. Just know that it is migration season. We are in the thick of it. So just to be aware, especially at dawn and dusk. And we do say it's a little troubling sometimes, but we'd rather you hit the animal than try and swerve and go off the highway and have a bigger accident. So just be careful out there.
Awesome.
Cool. And then we should be able to, so there is a Q&A feature that anyone that's participating remotely could use. Or you can also just drop something in the chat and that works as well. But any questions from the audience? Yeah, go ahead, Ari.
There was mention of building like underwater ways to go, like for animals that go in the water, basically, living for us and stuff. Is there any plan to add those around the same time as the one that's being planned right now? Like, are they going to be built around the same time, or is the underwater one just
So underwater, I'm trying to make sure I got the question right. So whether or not when we're building a new crossing, they would also be creating like a waterway passage connected to it, or
basically,
vice
like,
versa?
is there going to be something for underwater animals built around the same time, or is the underwater one just an idea?
So did you get that? It's probably for you, Rachel. And it's just a question about kind of pairing together an underwater passage with land-based passageways and whether or not that's kind of an idea on the table or something you're looking at, kind of always making sure we do them simultaneously when we're doing any project.
Yeah, so that definitely depends on what type of project we're doing and where it's located. So if we are looking to implement a wildlife crossing structure specifically, often that is in an area where there is not water moving because a lot of species don't want to move through water. However, we do have separate fish passage projects that are specifically for water-based animals like fish and some of our in-stream amphibians. So we'll treat those separately, and they'll have a separate a fish passage project, a culvert replacement project that'll be addressing those needs specifically. If we are working at a site where there's an opportunity to do both, we absolutely would, but oftentimes they are considered independently.
Awesome.
Thank you, Rachel, for that answer to the question. Great. We've got one more in the audience here, so we'll take that one, and then we've got one in the chat that we'll go to.
So you guys talked a lot about the smaller creatures being harder to fund for in order to find just like find funding for those sorts of projects. And you probably have considered this, so I may be crazy here, but like, have you ever like reached out to to departments like Fish and Wildlife or Agriculture or something like that to like try and get that sort of funding or awareness? Like I don't know.
And so I think that, well, I think a lot of us could probably touch on parts of that. I'll initially start with the fact that, and I guess Rachel, correct me if I'm wrong here, but ODFW, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, they are the ones without a specific dedicated funding for a lot of these projects. And so that's where a lot of that struggle is. There's the same funding struggle on the Department of Transportation's end, but they're also prioritizing, Department of Transportation is prioritizing safety-based projects. And so they end up prioritizing, large animals that cause more of a safety concern than the Department of Fish and Wildlife that also doesn't, neither agency really has the money that they need to be doing a lot more of these projects that we, think that we need to be doing. I don't know if there's any more details or what.
Yeah, they're very expensive. The crossing of I-5 initially came in at like $33 million. Like that's a lot of money that no agency really has. I think we've looked to the federal government a lot to try and get that money. That's what the Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program was intended to do. And I guess Representative Zinke just submitted some legislation to try and make that pilot program permanent. So we're hopeful that that funding source will continue. But I think the other thing is when we build these crossing structures, they do tend to pay for themselves after 10, 12, 15 years, depending on the cost. But it's a cost to Oregonians and to drivers. Like the agency doesn't see that money back. So it's not like there's no reason for ODOT to do them, but they don't. It's a big expense for them, and it's a benefit to society, not directly back to ODOT. So it just makes it hard to pencil out sometimes, especially when you talk about like rumble strips that are very cheap to to implement. So yeah, very expensive. Always open to hearing funding ideas. Forest Service has some, but I think everybody's just in funding it's a tough one right now.
Did you have anything more that you wanted to add there, Rachel? Okay.
Nope.
So one question in the chat is just what are some target areas or regions that you would like to see wildlife crossings implemented? There might be different targets or regions for each of you, maybe, but literally everywhere.
Literally everywhere. Yeah, I mean, this is a problem for the majority of our wildlife species. It's a problem the majority of the state. It's a problem anywhere from our interstate highways that often have such high traffic speeds and high traffic volumes that they're a complete barrier to species movement, down to even some of our forest access roads. And you wouldn't think that those would be much of an impediment, but we still see road-killed animals on those roads. So anywhere we have the opportunity to implement a crossing structure, I think it would be a worthwhile endeavor.
For ODOT, it's not everywhere, which I think is a good thing. We don't have collisions happening everywhere in the state for drivers, but Central Oregon, ODFW did a collared study back in 2012 between Bend and Klamath Falls, which is nearly a 100-mile stretch of highway, and deer are moving all over the place. It's not like places in Colorado where you have the mountains that drive animals to very specific places. It's more what we call sheep flow migration, where they're crossing everywhere. So you really need a lot of structures. I think ODFW now is recommending having them every mile or so, because when you add fencing, at some point you can't have an animal running along a fence for 5-10 miles, or they'll give up and turn around. And those animals have to move and migrate or they die. So We need a lot more structures on 97, and then we're also exploring the area between Bend and Subtle Lake on Highway 20 near Sisters as another area where there's a lot of migratory deer and elk that are causing roadkills. Also east of Eastern Oregon near Gentura, there's a large stretch of highway, maybe 30 miles long, where just deer are getting hit right and left. So a lot of truck traffic over there, moving at high speeds. So those are probably the top three, but also Southwest Oregon pops up, I-5. We do have some issues on I-5, and probably Rich would probably say that we have issues in areas where ODOT at least isn't tracking species as well as we'd like to. So yeah, it's hard because ODOT maintenance crews collect data on where animals are getting hit, but it doesn't tell us necessarily where animals are getting across the highway successfully. So we kind of rely on ODFW's collar data and some of those other studies, which are expensive and time consuming and all the things. So yeah.
I think this question probably is more for Sydney, but maybe for both of you, which is just how much of a priority is put on when road work is already scheduled or being done, that there's some type of review. And I guess this is where it comes into being for Rachel as well, like that the review happens, that it says, well, we're already spending X. If
Mm-hmm.
we spend a little bit more, you know, we could put some type of crossing in this section or whatever. Because I often think back to the fact that we constructed these roadways in the first place, kind of
Mm-hmm.
setting aside the fact that we share this landscape with so many other species. Now we've recognized that. And so, moving forward as we're doing more of these projects, how much is that being considered on kind of a, project by project basis?
I would say that it's in all of our documentation for that project planning. We have those feasibility studies showing us what to do and where. The problem is we don't have a funding source. So we've been very opportunistic to date. So, we learned about a project with the passing lane, and it's like we kind of scramble with our nonprofit partners or grant programs to come up with money. You don't know if you're going to get the grant. The grant might not line up timing wise with the project. So that's a real challenge, not having a stable funding source where you can plan ahead and be part of that 2-year ODOT project planning process. Also, ODOT, it's hard to believe, but there's no money. So like our maintenance crews right now, they don't even maintain the fencing that we have. We have volunteers with the Oregon Hunters Association that go out every spring and fall, and they inspect the fence, they make minor repairs, and they oversee contracts sometimes for if it's a major repair. So ODOT just isn't staffed financially to be able to do a lot of that work. And a lot of these things sound really simple, and they can be, but there's the long-term maintenance and what happens if it fails. So there's a lot of conversations we're starting with ODFW and our nonprofit partners to kind of wrap our head around these, like what do you do long term, because most of us won't be here forever. So yeah. And then lastly, I would say there are also limitations on how money can be spent. Like ODOT has these different buckets. Some is federal money for specific projects, and our state constitution prevents ODOT from spending money on projects that don't benefit safety. So that means we need an alternative funding source, and that's where we run into some problems sometimes of like making sure the right color money is used on the right project.
Cool. Thank
It's
you.
the fun non-construction like policy kind of stuff that
Yeah.
ends up taking the most of the work and effort, it seems like.
Yeah. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Rachel. No. Any more questions from, yeah.
Based on like already existing crossings, how long does it typically take to build one of the bigger ones for like deer and bears versus the smaller ones for like amphibians?
Uh, I don't know. I don't know how well you can hear the audience
Yeah, I
questions.
can hear.
Okay, great. Go
Yeah, I
ahead.
think like under crossings can be done in a couple months, or the ones that have been done for ODOT on US 97 had been piggybacked onto existing projects. Like I said, we were trying to be opportunistic to leverage costs and just this time. So really just a couple months. The I-5 will be a bit longer. That is a standalone, and that's a big project. So probably at least one full construction season, which obviously happens during the summer, spring, early fall. So at least one, possibly, quite possibly two. I'm not sure how long the
Even
frog project took, Rachel.
Yeah, I was going to say some of the projects for smaller bodied species can take just as long as the larger projects. It depends on site complexity. So the frog crossing that we just implemented outside Portland, we began construction in April and finished the end of November. So there was a lot of traffic control measures that had to go into place there, and working carefully to avoid utilities and rerouting an existing stream so that it wouldn't inundate our brand new frog crossing, so that, depending on the complexity of the site and the number of things that have to be done to install something, it can take just as long as one of the larger structures.
Yeah, I feel
and
like if money isn't an issue, you can build things really, really fast. Contractors can work weekends and round the clock, and but it'll cost you. So there's that balance again between cost and time.
Yeah, and I mean, just going back to what you had highlighted earlier about the process and like the whole circle that went up there of how they go about doing this, even when you mentioned, having one built in a month or even, 6 or 8 months, it's like there's so much that's going into it before you get to the construction phase. And so much then that goes into it afterward in terms of maintenance and monitoring to see the success of it.
Yeah.
Which actually, in terms of monitoring, I'm curious. Do you have trail cams on all of the existing crossings?
So we did for the first two under crossings on 97, we had a 5-year monitoring period. And then because it's very hard to find money for construction, but really hard to find money for monitoring. So then there was a break. But more recently, when we built the two Gilchrist undercrossings, ODFW has been funding OSU Cascades in Central Oregon to monitor those again. And I think there's a desire by OSU Cascades to do a long-term monitoring effort. It's just how do we pay for that? But it is done with trail cams, quite a few of them. And then also looking at roadkill data from maintenance and ODFW and others. And then for the Bendesettle Lake area, it's the first time we're putting, well, I guess the I-5, we're putting cameras out before construction. So really trying to get a better idea of how animals are using the landscape before construction, which will be really interesting. And then ODFW also put a handful of collars on elk to kind of see how they're moving in that area. So it's not always a guaranteed thing though. So it's a lot of coordination with other efforts and trying to find money from different pockets to help that effort.
That's great. Any other audience questions or folks online? Nothing new coming through in the chat at this point. Did you have anything, Kat?
I was wondering if like Fish and Wildlife, ODOT probably doesn't. If you put any emphasis on like focusing on an endangered species or like more high risk species, or if it's all about just like density of migration when you are kind of deciding where like what kind of crossings to put in.
I mean, we absolutely focus on our species' greatest conservation need, including threatened and endangered species. Those are a big deal for us. Obviously, like our agency is tasked with managing the state's fish and wildlife species. So the last thing that we want is for one of those to go extinct. So we are always looking at opportunities for those species in particular. I mentioned the northwestern pond turtle and the coastal martin. Those are probably the two threatened and endangered species that are most prominently affected right now by road mortality that we're looking into some sort of mitigation options for those species. But again, since ODOT is primarily focused on motorist safety and those are smaller bodied species that don't impact motorist safety, it's very difficult for us to find the funding to be able to implement those projects.
Yeah, and I would say that ODOT absolutely, we have to comply with the Endangered Species Act. So if we had a specific project in an area that had threatened or endangered species, we would have to do consultation, and we have done that for other projects. But if we're not doing a project in an area, then it's really hard to make that nexus for funding, and that would require mitigation or anything along those lines.
Cool.
That's great. So yeah, from there, unless Sydney or Rachel had anything come to mind that they really wanted to make sure and highlight through any of those questions, we can wrap it up now. And primarily just want to highlight that the power of connection is not a new idea. As a species, it's one of the reasons that we built so many miles of roads to protect, connect ourselves to the goods and services and that we need, or, the other people that we want to connect to survive. And so, moving forward, we just need to have more of an emphasis on, you know, connecting of being thoughtful about how we share this landscape with all the other species that are here, that we're not alone in needing that connection. And so that's really this proven solution. These wildlife crossings are really what, the way forward in terms of building these bridges. And we're excited that you guys could make it. We're excited that the folks that are watching online could be here. We're really thankful for Sydney and Rachel to be able to give us the insight from the on the ground work that you all have been doing for so long on this front. And thank you so much for all of that, and then also for taking the time to connect with us and connect with students and the campus community here. And then I'll hand it off to Kat to
Yeah.
finish off completely.
I just say we'd love to keep doing work around this issue. So continue to reach out as students. We'd love to keep working with other organizations. And we really can do a lot when we organize people and we organize the public, and everyone really works together and is passionate about this issue collaboratively. And I just hope that you're all excited to take what you learned today. I think we learned a lot of cool things that I didn't know. I've been doing a lot of research on this all term, and I still learned a lot more today than I knew already. So yeah, let's keep working together, and we're so happy to have you all here. Our wildlife really depend on us doing this work to help them. They can't go advocate for themselves, so we have to do it on their behalf. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. And one last thank you to Sydney and Rachel. I look forward to staying in touch as we continue this work.
Yeah, please do. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.